When Pastor John Heidegger called me a few weeks ago to tell me that I was the recipient of this award, I told him that I was particularly honored to accept it because I had known and studied with Pastor J. Benjamin Bedenbaugh. It took me a while to realize that Pastor Heidegger had never had Ben Bedenbaugh as a professor, since he graduated in 2000 and Dr. Bedenbaugh died in 1993. And then I began to think that there must be quite a few alums here today, along with all of you graduating seniors, who never knew Professor Bedenbaugh. So today I'd like to say something about J. Benjamin Bedenbaugh, and why it may be that a man who spent virtually his whole ministerial career as a New Testament professor at this seminary is associated with an award given to parish pastors for pastoral leadership. John Benjamin Bedenbaugh always preferred being called Ben, but when his students and many others talked about him, they almost always called him Benny. And perhaps that was because he was so endearingly vulnerable. He was a big, handsome man, about 6'3", and a bit beefy when I knew him, with a voice that could be commanding and intimidating whenever he wanted it to be. Nobody ever fell asleep in one of Benny Bedenbaugh's classes. As a teacher, he was witty, he was learned, he was often brilliant. Yet in one-to-one situations, he was often painfully shy and nearly tongue-tied. And that was especially true when he was in the presence of women. In the fall of 1975, I was assigned to Dr. Bedenbaugh as his advisee, as an incoming junior. And he was always a little like a scared rabbit whenever he had to speak to me. After teaching nothing but male students for over 20 years, he was fearful about how women would respond to him and to his teaching style. And yet he, like the other members of the faculty in those days, believed in the theological and the biblical rightness of women's ordination. Dr. Bedenbaugh and the entire faculty did their best to support women students here, despite the fact that they, the faculty, were all male, and that at the time virtually none of them had ever even seen an ordained woman preach or celebrate communion, Lutheran woman. Ben was the son of an old South Carolina Lutheran family which had been here since well before the war between the states. He had a certain southern courtliness about him, and with it an habitual courtesy that never kept him from being open and honest with all people, even if they disagreed with him. And it never prevented him from clearly and forcefully proclaiming the gospel to those whose political or social or cultural biases had caused them to ignore or pervert that gospel, and especially if they were loyal Lutheran church members who were ignoring or perverting the gospel. Ben's students loved him, but that love was equaled by the affectionate regard and appreciation of the lay people in many of the congregations surrounding this seminary and throughout this state and beyond. In the 60s and the 70s, asking Professor Bedenbaugh to come preach and or lead a Bible study in one's church was a frequent practice of his former students, who were now pastors struggling with various social issues, especially in those days, the issue of race. So Benny would come and he'd preach or he'd do a Bible study on, say, Luke 15. Except that he would use as his text Clarence Jordan's cotton-packed version of the New Testament. Now, his former students had heard him read those passages many times in class, but the unsuspecting lay people were shocked and sometimes incensed to hear that the victim on the road to Jericho was a white man and the Good Samaritan was black. Now, we may have forgotten how very difficult it was to be a faithful and committed parish pastor during the era of Martin Luther King Jr. and Vietnam. But I think We all know how much courage it takes to preach and teach the gospel of Jesus in every time when Christ's gospel contradicts the prevailing attitudes and prejudices of our society and our culture. Dr. Bedenbaugh was never shy or reticent when it came to defending the gospel. For him, after so many years of study and reflection on the New Testament, the gospel was always the gospel of grace, of forgiveness, and of the surpassing love of God in Christ Jesus. There is no room in that gospel for human exclusiveness, or even for our self-satisfied judgment and vilification of those who differ from us on how to address the various issues confronting the church. For Ben, even the Decalogue always had to play a muted second fiddle to the gospel's law of love. It would be interesting to see how he would bring his deep devotion to Christ and the gospel to bear on some of the pastoral, ecclesiastical, and social issues of this century. I believe he would have counseled us all to sin boldly on the side of grace. Seminaries are much more than just professional schools. Seminaries truly are seedbeds for the growing of pastors and other servants of Christ's church. Their students are formed spiritually as well as professionally. And the professors teach things eternally more important than just proper doctrine or how to write a sermon or how to teach a confirmation class. Professors are witnesses to the faith. Their personal professions of faith remain in the hearts and minds of their students long after the fine points of doctrinal and ecclesiastical disputes have been forgotten. One seminary experience permanently shapes one's ministry, for good or for ill. And I speak from more than 30 years of experience of hearing the admonishments of my professors in my head as I was doing everything from writing sermons to filling out parish reports. So if I have been truly a good pastoral leader, then I must attribute that mostly to the servants of Christ at this seminary who taught me how to be a good pastor. I thank God for all of those faithful teachers, but most especially today,